Hi there, welcome back to my channel, the best place on the internet for Pathfinder lore and history. If you like this kind of content, be sure to like and subscribe, and if there's anything you'd like to know about in particular, let me know in the comments below, as I do read all of the comments. We're going back to Avestan this week with the region deep dive around Galt. Now, Galt is an interesting nation. In terms of the supporting content, Galt never received a dedicated resource guide, so there wasn't one source that I could go to that had everything. However, Galt has been part of the sort of Pathfinder adventure series going back to the very beginnings of the game, and some of the iconic characters developed at the formation of the setting have continued to become really important as the setting has evolved and progressed over the years. So collating all the information for this video was a lot of fun. I imagine we'll be getting more Galt content in the second edition. We've already had a major module take place there in second edition, so this is a country to keep your eye on as the setting continues to grow and evolve. Enjoy. The history of Galt. The first great army of exploration, which led the Empire of Taldor northwards beyond the Fog Peaks, brought into the fold the region that is now called Galt. Conquered by the famous Taldan general Porthmos from the Kelid barbarians who had previously held that land, the lands of Galt were thereafter settled by Taldans from the heartland of the Empire, starting as early as the year 37. By the year 115, Galt was formally incorporated as a province of Taldor, the first such region to be incorporated that exists beyond Taldor's borders of today. In keeping with the traditions of Taldor, the settled lands were divided into provinces, duchies, and counties, which were held by various branching lines of the old Taldan nobility, weaving a complex tapestry of political intrigue, alliances, and betrayals that would last for over 4,000 years. It is not, however, this rich and ancient history that defines the Galt of today. Rather, it is its more modern history. Those 4,000 years were not uneventful, but they did not substantially change the status quo in Galt to any great extent. You can see additional details about the history of the broader Taldan Empire in my Taldor video, in my Cheliax video, and in my Andoran deep dive videos, all linked below. The first great change to the status quo in Galt would occur in the year 4081, when Governor Aspects of the western province of Cheliax broke with the Empire of Taldor. Governor Aspects would become King Aspects of Cheliax, and later that same year King Aspects would approach the Grand Duke of the province of Andoran, and offer the High Lords of Andoran favorable taxation terms and a stronger trade alliance, plus no conditions of conscription of Andoran forces in general imperial conflicts. Andoran seceded from Taldor and joined with Cheliax. Thereafter King Aspects of Cheliax became known as Aspects the Even-Tongued, for his ability to conquer territories without having to lift a sword to do it. Towards the end of that year, King Aspects the Even-Tongued sent envoys to Galt, and the Taldan holdings north of Galt as well, offering them the same terms they had offered Andoran. Galt also seceded from Taldor, and became a part of the rapidly expanding Chelish Empire. The lands north of Galt, however, did not accept Cheliax's terms, opting instead to form a new, loose federation of nations known as the River Kingdoms. Despite switching to the new Empire of Cheliax during the Even-Tongued conquest, mostly to avoid the onerous Taldan taxes and the tithing of soldiers to fight on the southern Khadiran front, in actual fact from 4081 to 4606, about 500 years in all, Galt continued to operate in more or less exactly the same way as they had done in the previous 4,000 years. However, there were some subtle shifts happening to the fabric of Galtish society that were happening so gradually that it's likely the lords and ladies of the time were not totally aware. The first of these had to do with how taxation changed under Chelish law, and how Cheliax had incentivized broader education programs and small business ownership. As a result, the Taldan tradition of serfdom was being gradually replaced by a mixture of the labor class and a new up-and-coming merchant class that owned capital and paid taxes based on business transactions rather than based on the ownership of land. They also moved away from more agrarian work and focused more on manufactured goods, all of which necessitated a general uplift in the base level of education of the province's lay people. This transformation is also described in my Aspis Consortium faction guide, and in my Andoran region deep dive video as well, which culturally always had a lot in common with Galt. In fact, during the period of Ardenite Chelish rule, Galt really cemented its reputation as a nation of free thinkers, and its ever-expanding intelligentsia actually comprised a mix of high and low-born citizens. Soon this reputation began to attract foreign scholars and independent thinkers to its prestigious universities, and adventurers to its unspoiled forests. For a time, its renowned and brilliant poets, artists, and philosophers would begin to export more than trade goods. They exported ideas that would shape the politics of the whole of Avestan. However, despite this growing bourgeoisie movement, some of whom no doubt bristled at the vast power that the noble classes still held, and had simply inherited by birthright, there were no major civil revolutions during the period of Aradanite Chelish rule. However, that would all change with the disappearance of the god Aradan during the Death of Prophecy event of 4606. The empire was plunged into civil war, and though the civil war was primarily fought in the western regions of Cheliax, there was a growing sense across the provinces of Galt that with this civil war there came a chance to come out of it with something new, something more effective, that allowed for more opportunities at wealth and advancement for the small folk of the country. That dream never came to pass. It took 33 years for victors to emerge in the Chelish Civil War, and when they did, it would turn out to be the Asmodeus-worshipping House of Thrun. The House of Thrun dispatched their armies to all parts of the former Chelish Empire, including Andoran and Galt, accompanied by legions of Hell Knights and bound devils. They began to construct Asmodean churches, and ensured towns and cities were governed by Thrun loyalists. The hopes and dreams of a freer Galt after the Civil War were dashed. However, Galt was far from the heart of the empire, and its radical thinkers were more brazen and more outspoken in this remote province than they were in the heartland of Cheliax. Seeing the blatant devilry and capricious cruelty of their new masters served as a spark to galvanize a sentiment that had been growing even before the Death of Prophecy. Dissent began to bubble up in Galt. One of the most elegant proponents of this unrest came from the half-elf philosopher Hossetter, who wrote the scathing political essays Imperial Betrayal in 4641. These essays helped increase dislike of Imperial Cheliax and spread dissent across Galt, Andoran, and even into the heartland as well. In 4642, only a year later, Darl Ubanik, a writer and philosopher from Woodsedge, added further fuel to the fire when he published his own attack on Cheliax and the concept of the divine right of kings, which he called On Government. On Government was astonishingly popular, and it was quickly outlawed by House Thrun, but secret copies exchanged hands all over the empire. Darl's book was among the first texts to propose a democratic rule, the incisive idea that all kinds of autocracy, but especially those stemming from birthright or primogeniture, were detrimental to society, and that the decisions of the majority should stand as the ultimate arbiter for just governance. This idea would have been incisive enough on its own, but Darl also implied in his book that the devil worship in the capital was a direct, almost inevitable result of this kind of autocratic rule. It was therefore shockingly anti-Thrun. Agents of the House of Thrun were dispatched to Galt to find and execute Darl Ubanik, but they could not reach him. Darl went underground, joining with various groups of adventurers which had long been drawn to Galt for its free, enterprising spirit. Together with fellow revolutionary philosopher Hossetter Half-Elven, Darl helped trigger the Red Revolution, a public uprising to resist Chelish rule. By 4644, Red Revolutionaries began executing members of the Thrun-backed government, until the government in Galt collapsed and Galt declared itself independent in 4667. The Infernal House of Thrun raged at this secession, but after having fought a long and costly civil war, and furthermore after struggling to combat the guerrilla tactics being employed by the Galtish revolutionaries, Thrun had no choice but to withdraw its forces from Galt and reconsider its approach. Staying would have been costly. Withdrawing may have proved even more so. Emboldened by the Galtish victory over House Thrun of 4667, the nation of Andoran had its own revolution 2 years later. The People's Revolt, as it came to be known, saw merchants and commoners joining forces with dissidents. They took to the streets, and they brought a swift death to all Thrun loyalists working in government, and interred or exiled those in other walks of life. Where the Galtish were using guerrilla tactics to dissuade Thrun meddling, relying on small pockets of heroes and adventurers to turn the tide, the Andorans were soldiers. The city of Augustana once housed the largest Chelish naval academy, and Andoran soldiers had long been drafted to serve in the great armies of exploration and along the Khadiran front. The People's Revolt was therefore more violent and bloody, closer in nature to the Chelish Civil War, and by the time Andoran finally achieved its independence, Cheliax had long abandoned any hope of bringing back into the fold the wayward province of Galt in its remote eastern reaches. However, despite the freedom from Cheliax, back in Galt, things were getting complicated. Darl Ubanik and Hossetter Half-Elven established a new interim government, called the Revolutionary Council. Their intent was to convert the nation into a functioning democratic republic, but this was complicated by the fact that Galt had long had a vast, sprawling, and well-established noble class. These nobles predated the Chelish Civil War, and they had effectively held lands and titles in Galt as described going back almost 5,000 years. Many nobles attempted to make arrangements with the Revolutionary Council, others tried to dismantle it by force. The Revolutionary Council convened after a particularly bloody clash between noble house guards and common-born revolutionaries in the streets of Isarn. Fellow councillor Marjorie Santrain is said to have been the first to observe the need to construct a humane, painless form of execution that would also prevent supposedly evil souls they executed from adding to the ranks of hell, and by extension strengthening the infernally backed government of Cheliax, from which they had of course just declared independence. It's not clear if the proposal itself was the result of meddling by a sinister cult, or if the cult was merely opportunistic and found in the request to commission such a weapon a chance to seize power. But the commissioning of the so-called final blades catalyzed a profound corruption of the nation. Before I cover more details on the blades, I should warn my viewers that some spoilers for the 2nd edition Pathfinder adventure Night of the Grey Death will be contained in the following section of the video. The final blades were massive guillotines, magically enchanted to trap the souls of the dead within the blades. They were designed by an organization called the Grey Gardeners. Originally presenting themselves as a faction of engineers, they eventually would become valued by the various ruling factions of Galt as executioners, and ultimately as important political advisors as well. For decades, in fact, the only stability in Galt's government would be the Grey Gardeners. They maintained their power and safety through anonymity, wearing masks so no member could be targeted by an angry mob, a possibly unnecessary failsafe as most feared the threat of execution via final blade should they ever attempt to move against the organization. The Grey Gardeners were based in the Grey Monastery of Litrin, rather than in the capital of Isarn, a large stone complex where they had first conceived of the blades. Unbeknownst to its populace through the decades of chaos, the Grey Gardeners were not simply engineers of the final blades, but in fact a terrible religious cult. Said to be descended from the demon lord Yedothrus, the Ravager Worm, described in more detail in my Demon Lord's creature feature, a lord of hate, death, and entropy, are massive demonic worm-like entities called Conqueror Worms. With the power of a demigod, these immense maggot-like monstrosities possess a vast intellect, can commune with their subjects telepathically, and are even able to grant divine magic. The Grey Gardeners, as it would turn out, were a Conqueror Worm cult, and the deployment of the final blades was all part of an elaborate plot to compress enough souls to release the Grey Deaths, enormous undead monstrosities that would feed and empower their worm god through the death of an entire nation. In order to continue to harvest souls in the final blades, however, the Grey Gardeners had to continually feed the revolution and ensure the blades would never go quiet. The Gardeners themselves manipulated much of Galt's chaos, staging execution festivals and funding the bandits that terrorized its rural regions, and they were further empowered by a psychic network of worm prophets. The first such counter-revolution was staged by the Gardeners in 4672. It was only 5 years after the revolution against Cheliax had been won, and Darl and Hosetter's Revolutionary Council was finally starting to get settled and reach terms with the less violent members of the remaining nobility, when the capital was surprise attacked by a bloodthirsty alliance of counter-revolutionaries, funded of course by the Gardeners. Hosetter lost his head to one of the final blades. Darl Ubanik instead fled to Andoran. Marjorie Santrain, who first proposed the construction of the final blades, also lost her head to one. After Hosetter and Marjorie's death, more than a dozen governments ruled Galt, none effectively. Galt cities, formerly centers of art and learning, fell into ruin. Without a strong central government, Galt's armed forces collapsed, allowing brigands and fell beasts to flourish in the wilds. The exact dates during which subsequent governments ruled are not totally clear, but of the dozen or so governments to rise and fall in the last 50 years, these are some of the more noteworthy ones. The Counter-Revolutionary Council replaced the Revolutionary Council after Hosetter was executed. Their rule was relatively short-lived, being replaced by the radical Caelian Council, chaired by a man named Durgan Rain, who believed Galt could only be saved through radical transformation, as he attempted to make changes to the names of the days of the week and even the alphabet. Rain also imposed martial law on the city and required mandatory conscription. He was later killed in a military coup by his own newly disciplined soldiers. Military rule was also short-lived. Galt was conquered by an alliance of well-funded aristocrats for a while, a faction called the Galt Creed Pact, headed up by Primarch Bremavir, who is discussed in more detail in my Darklands deep dive video. Bremavir's government was one of the rare governments that avoided the use of the final blades, suggesting that his revolution may have been one not sponsored by the Grey Gardeners, and may have been outside of their plan. Instead of using the final blades, Bremavir built a prison for political dissidents in the Fog Peaks, a location he likely fled to when the Galt Creed Pact eventually fell, and its other leaders were sent to the final blades. The location of the so-called Dread Dungeon was never divulged to the new government, and its exact location is still unknown in Galt today. The aristocratic Galt Creed Pact was replaced by the very unaristocratic Common Council. Its organizers believed that anyone with a political background was unworthy of rule, and so they elevated farmhands and beggars to positions of power within their council. They had a short-lived regime. A few other governments rose and fell after this, at least 3 by most counts, before the next notable government came to power. At the turn of the 48th century, so about 25 years into the revolutionary period, a faction calling itself the Eye of Law seized power, led by a woman named Traxilla. Traxilla's rule was particularly cruel and violent, and here an important figure emerges in Galtan politics. Some 3 years into Traxilla's brutal rule, another woman, about 28 years of age at this time, working as a government functionary and having some small amount of reputation for being the daughter of a prominent Galtan ambassador to Keonin, exposed Traxilla and her government as being a front for a hag coven. Traxilla herself fled the country, rather than meet her demise at the hands of the final blades. The young woman's name was Camelia Dranic, and the rooting out of Traxilla earned her a seat on the next Revolutionary Council, which was grimly named the Cabinet of Skulls. The cabinet was one of the longer-lived regimes, and Camelia served with them from 4703 to 4708, a remarkable 5 years. It was corrupt and autocratic, but less obviously capital E evil than the Hag Coven that ran the Eye of Law. Camelia kept her head down and tried to keep to the business of governance, and did not actively attempt to dismantle this government as she had with the Eye of Law. Nonetheless, their cronyism and self-serving nature allowed for another figure, the charismatic councillor Coran Goss, to rise up to power, galvanizing anti-cabinet sentiment by exposing some of the worst examples of their corruption. Coran Goss and his co-conspirators mostly eliminated all functionaries within the cabinet, but Camelia showed her deftness for politics by not only surviving this change of government, but actually retaining a post on the council. It was First Citizen Goss that began to phase out the term Revolutionary Council and began to refer to his council as the Galtan People's Council. Coran Goss's People's Council would hold power from 4708 to 4723. 15 years of continuous rule is the longest government since the Red Revolution. While this is partly a credit to Goss himself, who was a charismatic demagogue that his people believed might finally turn things around for Galt, there were actually several other factors at play. Firstly, serving under Goss was Camelia Dranic, who did her level best to enact meaningful reforms to bring some measure of order and stability back to Galt. Secondly, unbeknownst to either, the plan of the Grey Gardeners was finally coming to its completion, as they had acquired enough souls within their final blades, and they didn't need to keep spending their money on would-be revolutionaries to keep the cycle of violence going. In fact, though Goss did divert the mob's anger away from himself and the council, thanks to his gift for statecraft, he also unfortunately attributed Galt's many problems to neighboring nations, particularly Andoran, political damage that may take some time to undo. Regardless, in 4721, the Night of the Grey Death adventure path takes place. In this adventure, the Gardeners enact the final stages of their plan, hosting an event called the Mask of the Grey Death, in which they opened the Grey Monastery headquarters in Litrin for visitors for the first time. The ploy, of course, was to draw forth a large crowd, upon which to unleash the first of their Grey Death abominations. Fortunately, a faction of firebrands thwarted the plan, culminating in the destruction of the Grey Gardeners, their Grey Monastery, and several of the final blades themselves. Though that adventuring party disbanded after the destruction of the final blades, some of its members are believed to still be in Galt pursuing survivors of the Grey Gardeners and the destruction of the nation's remaining final blades. After this adventure, the Order of the Grey Gardeners was officially disbanded. However, due to their concealed identities, all surviving members remain potentially active in Galt, along with any final blades not already located and destroyed by the People's Council, the Firebrands. As the details of the threat that the Gardeners had posed to Galt began to emerge, many citizens called for Goss's resignation. Finally, and most recently in 4723, First Citizen Goss gave an impassioned speech to a crowd of protesters in Isarn to allay concerns over the safety of the nation. The ill sentiment in Galt, it seemed, was not fostered by the Gardeners alone. During the speech, members of the crowd dragged Goss down into the mob and beat him. Although brutally injured, Goss was not killed, but he was incapacitated, and in his absence, it did allow Camelia Dranik to step in and take over the council. In truth, Dranik firmly believed that Coran's tendency to attribute Galt's problems to external forces had exacerbated the country's plight over the last few years. Plus, Camelia was savvy enough to recognize that should Goss ever recover from his injuries, he would quickly try to return to power, so Coran Goss is currently being incarcerated in the Monolith, a large prison in the capital of Isarn. She has also taken other steps to swiftly secure her position. During her tenure, the People's Council initiated a campaign to eliminate rogue elements and destabilizing influences within Galt. However, in numerous instances, this endeavor primarily served as a means for Dranik to oust any who might challenge her authority. This brings us to today. The Grey Gardeners are gone, and with them, hopefully, the terrible influence of the demon worm is also gone, and the final blades are mostly destroyed as well. There is hope, perhaps, for a new chapter in the nation of Galt, and for the lofty ideals of its founders to finally come to fruition. On the other hand, the Galtish people have grown used to violence, and Camelia is no fresh-faced ingenue. She was born in 4667 in the midst of the First Red Revolution. She is now 58 years old, as of recording, and she has seen the rise and fall of a dozen governments in her lifetime. She has even served in the last 4 of those governments. Does she have the cunning and political influence to last as long as her predecessor, whose 15 years of rule was unprecedented? And if she does, what's to stop her from becoming yet another autocrat? If Darl Yubanik's promise is ever to come to pass, at some point Camelia would need to step down and allow for public elections to occur, and then to peacefully pass power to whomever is elected. Will that ever happen? Only time will tell. Galt Today. The First Revolutionary Council, co-chaired by Darl Yubanik and Hossetter Half-Elven, established a two-bodied government with the People's Council representing its executive branch, and with the chair of the council being recognized as the first among equals, but also a Senate, which was to be its legislative branch. Originally composed of 300 representatives, by the time Camelia took office, that number had dwindled down to 100, thanks to the Grey Gardeners. New senator elections, which were supposed to happen every 8 years, have been continuously postponed due to internal conflicts for decades, so many of these surviving senators have held power for decades. With no practical way of replacing these senators, their presence has provided a small modicum of stability in the otherwise anarchic nation. However, in the long run, this may prove bad for the country, as these senators are now deeply entrenched in the workings of the state, as frankly is Camelia herself. Clearly in Galt, there is a stark contrast between the way things were supposed to work and the way things actually work. So where Galt should have a reasonable balance of powers, in fact the responsibilities of government functions are not well understood, and there's not been enough stability for rules of precedent to form. As such, rule tends to go to whomever is the most politically savvy. This is somewhat the case in other places as well, it's just more obvious in Galt. In theory, the Senate should pass laws and operate the courts. In actual fact, sometimes senators run entire parts of the country, and other times they are completely powerless. One person who does wield power effectively, though, is the chairwoman of the People's Council, Camelia Dranik. So perhaps we can start our look at Galt today with a look at its leader. Born during the Red Revolution, Camelia escaped the initial chaos with her mother, Apalma Dranik, who was the Galtan ambassador to Kionin. Growing up among the elves in Yadara, Camelia quickly matured on the curious delights of the elven courts. She excelled in her studies, displaying an exceptional intellect for her age. However, the Revolutionary Council eventually called her family back home. Believing victory over the Chelish would bring stability to Galt, the Draniks were unprepared for what would come next. Crossing the border back into Galt, they were apprehended by the Grey Gardeners. Camelia's mother Apalma was accused of being an agent of the previous regime. She was dragged through the streets of Isarn and executed by final blade. Witnessing her mother's brutal death as a child shattered Camelia's world and marked her harsh reintroduction to the nation of Galt. In her teens, Camelia threw herself into politics, mourning her mother and burning with resentment towards the Grey Gardeners. Her passionate speeches and radical ideals quickly garnered followers. In her 20s, she made a grave mistake by too openly questioning the Grey Gardeners' methods. That night, a black bag was thrown over her head as she was kidnapped under the light of the full moon. She disappeared from Galtan politics for 15 years after that, but she re-emerged in her 30s. Camelia does not speak of the time she spent in the care of the Gardeners, nor of how she escaped them. After her return to Isarn, despite her desire to keep her head down, she couldn't stay away from politics. She carefully accepted an unassuming position as a minor government functionary. One thing led to another, and before long her instinct for trouble outweighed the acquired wisdom that was telling her to keep a low profile. Later that year, she came out and exposed the Eye of Law as a hag coven, and this made her a household name. If the Grey Gardeners realized who she was and what her history was, they would make no moves against her at this time. She was immediately given a seat on the new Revolutionary Council, a position she held on to thereafter. As we can see, Camellia has survived multiple regime changes, making her one of the few politicians to consistently navigate the treacherous tides of Galtan politics. She saw Citizen Goss overthrown and took his place as the chair of the Revolutionary Council. Since then, she has reversed course on a number of her predecessors' failed policies, notably ending the xenophobic sanctions that had damaged Galt's economic and political security. Her network of allies and resources extends throughout and beyond Galt, and she knows the value of rewarding her supporters with prestige and power. Her detractors, however, often meet untimely deaths, on occasion, it has been noted, marked by a deep blade wound, their souls missing, though Dranik herself has vowed no further use of the final blades. Camellia presents herself as an idealist. She likes to make the Red Revolution out to be a part of a broader wave of change across the continent, and in its inception she is perhaps right about this. She espouses the idea that Galarian is ready to overthrow its outdated systems, as evidenced by recent uprising and abolition efforts. She has even supported the efforts of the revolutionaries in Vidrian and Kintargo. She has also been working towards the goal of ridding Galt of the final blades for decades, even before coming to power, and it is her hope that removing Galt's final blades and dismantling the Grey Gardeners will be the legacy she is remembered for. She is also said to care deeply for the souls trapped within the blades, and this is likely earnest, given that her mother died at the hands of one. Even after the blades were dismantled, however, extricating the bound souls from the blades has proved tricky. Camellia has turned to an unlikely ally, the Ghost King Geb, for his expertise in this area. She has sent envoys to the undead nation, apparently seeking in exchange for freeing the trapped souls intelligence on the nation of Nex. This latter effort serves a twofold purpose. Firstly, to heal the wounds left behind by the final blades, but also beyond this, to prove that Galt is a player on the world stage. She is determined to prove this is the case once again. Camellia remains undeterred by its destroyed universities, starving people, and brigand-infested countryside. Her other diplomatic overtures have included outreaches to Grand Princess Eutropia of Taldor, and Dira Murasek of Andoran, and Queen Talandia Edasriel of Keonin. The appearance of a close relationship between Camellia and the female rulers of Galt's neighbouring nations has not gone unnoticed, with some detractors referring to them as the Four Queens, which Camellia finds patronising and frustrating. In addition to Chairwoman Camellia Dranik, the People's Council, and the Senate, a few other factions have significant sway in Galt. The first of these is the Firebrands faction. The Firebrands notably stormed the Grey Monastery of Litrin, interrupting the Night of the Grey Death and breaking up the Order of the Grey Gardeners. Firebrand activity in the country, however, has predated this event. In 4716, a group called the Blade Breakers, who would later claim ties to the Firebrands, attempted to take down the Grey Gardeners themselves. That group failed, and was then eventually disbanded, but their legacy endures to this day. Many different Firebrand groups are active in Galt, including the Unmaskers, the Shepherds of the Lost, and the Disciples of Yelaine. Plus, they are supported by individual noteworthy Firebrand activists, including the likes of Handish Tremel, Professor Thistle, and Amber Morell. All of these Firebrands are covered in a good deal of detail in my Firebrands Faction Guide. Firebrands are such a large faction in Galt that there are even some anti-Firebrand factions, groups who claim the Firebrands are forcing foreign ideals upon their nation. Chief among these are an anarchic sect known as the Broken Ghosts, who threaten to undo Galt's progress towards stability and plunge it back into chaos. A final important faction in Galt are the dispossessed nobility. As described in my history section, Galt had 5,000 years to cultivate a rich and complicated web of noble lineages that once held the highest positions of power in the country. In the last century, though, the Galtish nobility has all pretty much abandoned the country, as they were the most prized targets by revolutionaries for execution at the hands of the final blades. Galtish nobles have fled in large numbers to Taldor's northern province of North Tandak. They have also fled north to the river kingdoms, where they have formed not one, but at least two separate kingdoms, the central kingdom of Gralton, which is composed almost entirely of exiled Galtan nobles, and the nation of Liberthane in the southern river kingdoms, which, though it was founded by a paladin of Milani that espoused revolutionary Galtan ideals, has effectively acted like a military protectorate. Many Galtan nobles have travelled even further abroad as well, as far as the Isles of the Shackles in the south, and with a great many settling all the way north and east in the kingdom of Ayabaria, where they have become a particularly influential faction in the city of Mern Bay, as described in my Northeast Avestan video. With the defeat of the Grey Gardeners, some are considering a return to their homeland, which has the potential of bringing back some much-needed wealth to the country. On the other hand, the nobility is broadly disliked in Galt, and most nobles are not sure yet whether Camelia Dranic's regime will bring back a semblance of law and order, or whether it will simply collapse, like all the previous revolutionary governments. The Galt Gazetteer. The major territories and points of interest in the nation of Galt are as follows. Northern Galt. It is no coincidence that the independent kingdom of Liberthane was formed in the north of Galt. Those lands along the south bank were Galtish lands once. Located on the nation's periphery, the small towns and villages here have weathered much of Galt's turmoil quietly. In the distant cities, revolutionary governments come and go in a seemingly endless cycle of hope, disillusionment, and bloodshed, while the people here pay far more attention to providing for the needs of their own community. Rosehaven. Distance from the revolution has not made all the villages in northern Galt immune to the pitfalls of Galt's revolutionary zeal and the tragedies it can bring. About 3 decades ago, a small coven, dedicated to the vengeful goddess Girona, infiltrated the hamlet of Rosehaven, spreading paranoia and mistrust. Through careful whispers, planted evidence, and strategically timed murders, the coven dissolved the village's sense of community. Accusations of murder and treason ran rampant among the villagers, and suspicions flared into violent confrontations. The villagers were on a path to tear themselves and their settlement apart, when the local priest and town hero, Bernard Dupin, interceded. He bore a lantern that cast the light of revelation upon all before him, dispelling the coven's disguises and rallying the villagers to subdue and execute the villainous trio. To commemorate the anniversary of the village's triumph over evil, Rosehaven celebrates a 3-day festival each autumn. Villagers hollow out gourds, carve them with fanciful and even frightful designs, and place lit candles inside to ward off evil. On the last day, everyone gathers and ritually forgives each other for the past year's affronts. These acts honor their patron goddess Shaylin, who delights in artistic expression and acts of forgiveness. A gourd leshy has even taken to watching from afar during this festival, having come to terms with Rosehaven's grisly gourd art, and learning to appreciate the villagers' respect and perpetuation of gourds as a whole. In 4716, the Rosehaven Autumn Festival was interrupted thanks to the lingering corruption left behind by the Hag Coven. The details of these events are played out in the Pathfinder Society adventure Reaping What We Sow. Some noteworthy sites in the town of Rosehaven include the Silver Flute Inn, named for a silver flute displayed in a glass case in the common area. A traveling performer from the River Kingdom of Pitak stayed the night in Rosehaven and was so pleased with the hospitality that he left the instrument there as a gift to the village. A prominent temple of Shaylin, with local services still run by Father Dupin, the local hero that exposed the Hag Coven. It is also located near a communal herb and flower garden tended to by the entire town. The Dock Market. It adjoins the village's fishery, a large building where fishermen sort, clean, prepare, and preserve their catches. It is a small but well-provisioned market catering to passing boats. The market sells fish, seasonal crops, herbs, and spices. Finally, the watch house, run by Constable Elise Tivereau, who is fair, level-headed, and commands the Rosehaven Guard, a small militia that spends most of its time on other tasks, like repairs and harvesting, given Rosehaven's relatively peaceful existence. A retired Pathfinder named Armeline also has a well-appointed home in Rosehaven. Azurestone. Like Rosehaven, Azurestone is a remote settlement in northeastern Galt, located not too far from the Whistling Plains that forms the region's border. The further north and east one travels from Azurestone, the fewer and fewer settlements there are, because the Whistling Plains become fatally cold in the winter. Although there are some more easterly settlements, like Edmay, some way south and east of Azurestone, they are protected from the harshness of the cold steppe by the protective cover of the Borewood Forest. This remote settlement of just under 1,000 people, however, has managed to insulate itself from the harsh climate through the use of an ancient magical artifact called the Vernal Key. Azurestone is the site of one of the earliest Pathfinder modules ever published, The Flight of the Red Raven, which takes place in the year 4708, the year of Pathfinder's original release. In this adventure, the Vernal Key is stolen by a famous bandit and revolutionary named the Red Raven, who will later become a Pathfinder iconic, and who the heroes chase to the Fog Peaks, where he attempts to use the key to open a Jathum's treasure hoard and also rescue his paramour, Jeppa of Casimir. Presumably the Vernal Key was returned, but the Red Raven escaped based on current events. Azurestone appears to have continued to grow in prominence in the region in the almost 20 years since that adventure was first published. The village of Azurestone gets its name from the blue mineral found in the region. Its chief industries are mining of stone and gems, and farming. The villagers are mostly human, but there is a significant dwarven minority that dwells here as well, particularly on the south side of town near the quarry. Other ancestries and foreigners typically live on the west side of town, where a trade road connects with the village of Edme. Noteworthy sites in the town of Azurestone include the Deerstalker's Lodge. This wooden lodge houses visiting hunters and other travelers. The owner, Ost Untamoinen, a half-elf, is a well-known hunting guide. Visitors to the lodge will note that the accommodations here are more Spartan than the prices might suggest. The Inclusive Hall. The village's larger church serves as both Temple of Erastil and town meeting hall for the villagers. The priest Ilmanu Luko lives in the rectory behind the hall and maintains it for both religious and secular purposes. The vernal key is traditionally kept in a reliquary here above the rostrum. The Stone Shrine. This church is one of the few all-stone buildings in Azurestone. Services at the Stone Shrine are practiced in the Dwarven language and manner for a predominantly Dwarven congregation. Ilda Sepatar is the High Priestess of Torag at the Stone Shrine. The Sauna. The Satis Sauna is a combination bathhouse and brewery. Customers can take a cleansing sauna followed by a dip in the cold pool and then enjoy a hydrating drink. Marja Stonehands is the hostess, brewmaster, and village midwife. The Square. This open-air market serves as an outlet for local farmers and visiting merchants. Surrounding the square are the shops of resident craftsmen, such as Kaiser, a renowned crafter of string and percussion instruments. In festival times, which is actually fairly often, the square is bustling with stalls and entertainers. The Lattice Inn. Catering primarily to traveling merchants, the Lattice Inn provides both shared accommodations and private rooms. The tavern serves common fare, although higher quality meals can be arranged for the right price. The Lakainen family owns the inn, with matriarch Jan Lakainen chiefly in charge, but almost all of the staff are related to the family in some way. The Watch House. The town's reeve, or sheriff, is a man named Antero Ikonin. He is a bald man with graying hair at his temples. Though he's getting on in years, he has no plans to retire anytime soon. The Borewood Territory. The Borewood is the largest forest in Galt, stretching over 200 miles west to east. Yet it never widens to more than 40 miles wide, north to south. It lies east of the capital of Isarn, and north of the Kantele River and the Fog Peaks. The cities of Halvan, Farnvale, Edme, and Staven Tower all lie in its borders. The Borewood's easternmost tree marks the eastern border of Galt itself. In ancient times, before the Earthfall Cataclysm, just like the Himbrian forest in the west, this forest was originally held by the first elves that came to Galarian. Located in a cavern under the forest, below what was once an elven temple, is an active Ayudara, or elven waygate, known as the Galt Gate. The elven temple above it was sacked by soldiers of Taldor during their northern conquests, but its ruins are still impressive. The cavern itself is large, 200 feet in diameter, and decorated with humming crystals and floating lights. Another of the Borewood's claims to fame is the Mosswood Maiden. Along the Glimmer Creek, which cuts through the Borewood, the soggy soul of a mournful maiden, known as Maven Mosslight in the tales, has wandered the mossy shores of the wood for decades since her murder. She carries a lantern, seeking a lost love, and leads all perceived impostors to a watery grave. According to the tales, Maven was a lady from an esteemed family in pre-revolutionary Galt. She fell in love with the wealthy Lord Rhaenys Whitechaste. She arranged a blind rendezvous with Lord Whitechaste, as her low-born and envious servant Silnia had advised her. As the women travelled in the twilight by skiff to the secret place they had arranged to meet Lord Whitechaste, Silnia murdered Maven, throwing her body into the murky river. Silnia pretended to be Maven that night, and seduced Rhaenys, who had never met her before. She eloped with him, and is said to have ultimately become the Lady Whitechaste. Halvan. Located just north of the Borewood is the town of Halvan. It has about 2,000 residents, and it is therefore about twice the size of Azurestone, although it is somewhat less influential as it doesn't have the wealth brought to it by the Azure mines, and as it was rather more directly impacted by the cycle of bloody revolutions of the last 100 years. Halvan is perhaps the most famous, though, for being the home of Aric of Halvan, one of the Pathfinder iconics, and perhaps better known as the Red Raven. Like Camelia's mother, Aric's parents were taken by the Grey Gardeners and executed by final blade. The orphaned boy was raised at Sister Serinda's home for revolutionary orphans, and forced into work sewing clothes while being bombarded with a succession of Galtan revolutionary propaganda. As a young adult, he endeared himself to Thanaris, the leader of a group of bandits wronged by Galt's Red Revolution. Thanaris mentored and trained Aric in both honorable behavior and in combat, until Thanaris' capture and subsequent execution. Arik recovered Thanos' red cape from his discarded remains, then went on a murderous rampage against the Cabinet of Skulls, the revolutionary council who had ordered Thanos' death. The tales of a red-cloaked killer leaving behind bodies to be picked over by ravens inspired his vigilante name, the Red Raven. The subsequent People's Council, led by Coran Goss, embraced the Raven and asked him to perform tasks on his behalf, though Arik eventually rebelled as Goss's requests grew increasingly violent. Arik was captured by the Gardeners in this period, though before his own execution Arik was set free through the help of a friend and legal clerk named Quinn. Arik now wanders the Inner Sea region with the recreation of his original Red Raven costume, and mainly commits daring, high-profile thefts against the wealthy that help his image as a hero of the downtrodden common folk. Folktales describe the Red Raven as a criminal who strikes only against arrogant nobles and corrupt merchants, with rumours that he is the lost son of the original revolutionary Darl Yabanik. In truth, Arik has always been less concerned about corruption than he has been about making money and having daring adventures, but he's not one to undervalue good PR. Farnvale. At 1,500 residents, Farnvale is somewhat smaller than Halvin, but larger than Azurestone. It's a surprisingly large town given its remote location. Farnvale is located in the densest part of the Borewood, far from other larger settlements, ensuring that trade is scarce and visitors are rare. Farnvale was founded in 4630 by a group of lumberjacks, trappers, and hunters, frustrated by the fees they had to pay to trade in Isarn. Led by the charismatic Zarin Rosslander, they had entered the Borewood, eventually settling on an idyllic meadow bordered by hills deep in the forest. When the Red Revolution began, Farnvale swelled in size, as it accepted refugees fleeing the violence in large cities. Its self-sustainability and lack of trade kept it away from the prying eyes of the Grey Gardeners. However, as we've seen with the village of Rosehaven, some of these Galtish cities that try to avoid the scrutiny of the Gardeners sometimes fall prey to other predators, as they have no allies to call on for help. In 4701, Jura Corton, a citizen of Farnvale, entered the Borewood and was consumed by a body thief plant. All of Farnvale's inhabitants have been transformed by the body thief into pod-spawned duplicates of the original people. They try to masquerade as humans, but the disguise is never perfect, as they lack emotions or the need to eat and rest, and their friendliness is unsettlingly artificial to the students of psychology. The residents know that visitors who stay too long might be able to figure out the truth. As a result, they usually try to discern if a particular visitor would be missed or not if they disappeared, by asking ostensibly idle questions about their friends and plans. Those who would not be missed are overpowered and brought before the body thief to be assimilated, while the others are encouraged to leave town as quickly as possible. Edmei. The city of Edmei, in the easternmost reaches of Galt north of the Borewood, was once famous for its many colleges and universities, reputed as a great centre of learning and the arts. Edmei is by far the largest city in the region, with a population of almost 14,000 residents. Edmei was also the home of one of Galt's most renowned citizens and earliest revolutionaries, the philosopher Hossetter, who once served as dean of the prestigious Torvin Academy. Hossetter was executed by the final blade known as Razor Jenny, located in the center of the Torvin Academy's once elegant quadrangle. The Torvin Academy was then converted into a political prison, and the sinister alchemist Ezrabet Levanza took up a position as a surgeon at the Academy, using the cadavers of those executed by the guillotines to create flesh golems for the Revolutionary Council. What the fate of Ezrabet is since Camellia came to power is not known. In addition to the failed state of Edmei's former centers of learning, other problems have plagued the city. Due to ongoing disease and pestilence in the surrounding countryside, food has become scarce in Edmei over the last decade. This has led ordinary citizens to turn on each other in search of food, resulting in widespread banditry and looting. For those reasons, the Red Raven is often active in the city of Edmei, though in truth, despite his best efforts, Edmei continues attracting criminals from all over Galt. Staven Tower. Staven Tower is connected to the capital of Isarn by way of the Cantelli River, and to the city of Edmei by way of a well-travelled forest trail. Functioning as a stopover town between the two more politically important cities, Staven Tower has nonetheless grown from the trade that passes through. 5,000 residents live in Staven Tower. Central Galt. Central Galt is defined by a number of rivers that descend from the Fog Peaks and meet the East Selen 20 miles northwest of the capital of Isarn. The Stormflood, the Nordine, the Cantelli, and the Glimmer all connect and meet up, flowing north to the capital. The two significant cities of Central Galt are the capital of Isarn and the city of Litrin. Isarn. Isarn is located in a bend on the Stormflood River. Its banks are lined with innumerable yellow irises, the city's signature flower. Before the revolution, irises were royal property, and taking them without permission was punishable by death. Curiously, this crime and sentence remained unaltered during most of the Revolution. It is the capital of Galt and a thriving metropolis, in spite of its many challenges, with a population of over 50,000. Isarn was once a city of art that was graced by beautiful architecture, green parks, and statuary. Isarn's public monuments and buildings, once so famed that designers from both Avestan and Garand competed for the right to add to their grandeur, fell into blood-splattered disrepair after the beginning of the Red Revolution. Despite its dilapidated condition, the city's design harkens back to the monumental architecture of the Age of Destiny, with engraved cobblestones, wide plazas, parks, and sweeping bridges. First Citizen Camelia Dranik is doing her level best to clean up the capital. During the Revolution, many of Galt's noble families were forced from their homes. Their abandoned manor houses were often annexed by members of each new ruling government and used for various purposes, such as asylums or salons for lavish parties. Property laws are complicated now, and though there are people like Firebrand Amber Morell trying to fix some of this mess, it will take some time before it all gets sorted. Until then, squatters' rights remain the de facto law of the land. Important locations in Isarn include the People's Hall, where Camelia Dranik's People's Council convenes, the Monolith, a blackened fortress and prison, in front of which once stood the most impressive final blade of all, known as Madame Marjorie, a guillotine kept well oiled by the Grey Gardeners. The House of Joy, a converted noble palace that has been turned into a large temple of Callistria, and finally the Eglantine House, a center of scholarship and magical research which the brothers Norit and Orlan Gantier have tried to maintain despite trying times. The first edition Pathfinder Society adventure Fury of the Final Blade and the second edition Pathfinder quest Forged Facade take place in Isarn. The second one takes place in the current timeline and sheds some insight into how Isarn has changed in the last 5 years. In this adventure, the heroes are invited to an evening salon at Azriana Vaville's art gallery. Azriana Vaville is a wealthy, influential bureaucrat in Camelia's new government, who fancies herself an art critic. She has hosted a series of parties at an abandoned manor house, which was once turned into an asylum and has now been turned into an art gallery, which has drawn artists, bureaucrats, and rising citizens from all corners of Galt. While she prides herself on her artistic eye, her true aim is to use her charisma and influence to amass greater wealth and power. She doles out praise and harsh criticism as favors, creating and ruining careers with a few careful words. It's an open secret that Azrenia Vaville has in fact terrible taste in art, but no one dares to tell her this. Trinsky Hattenpock is a reclusive artist who has endured the political storms of Galt for several decades. Recently, he incurred the wrath of a rival, Baltaram Crunot, by publicly criticizing Baltaram's latest work. In retaliation, Baltaram framed Trinsky for creating a forgery, planting evidence for Azrenia to find. Azrenia evidently fell for the ruse, declaring Trinsky a fraud and plunging him into disgrace and poverty. Trinsky has not ventured out in public for weeks. The heroes are drawn into the story by Trinsky's sibling, Chance Hattenpock, who desperately wishes to uncover which of Trinsky's rivals is responsible for the framing and expose their deception. As we can see, Isarn is in a state of recovery, but it's a decadent mess, and it's a far cry from the city it was before the revolution began. Litrin. Litrin is a sizable town, home to about 5,000 people. It was best known for being the site of the Grey Monastery. Prior to the revolution, Litrin was once a major center of trade in Galt, due to the fertile Stormflood River Valley. Farmers brought their grain to the city's many mills, and from there the flour was shipped throughout the country. The Red Revolution began early in Litrin, however, and many wealthy merchants and mill magnates were indiscriminately put to death, nearly causing the complete destruction of the town. This collapse was prevented by the arrival of the Grey Gardeners, with their final blades, who put an end to the random violence and substituted it with their own more carefully regulated brand of death. The headquarters of the Grey Gardeners was an imposing monastery that sat just off the docks. Whether from respect or fear, the ever-hungry, often bloodthirsty mobs that roved across the rest of Galt avoided Litrin entirely. This did not serve to make Litrin a safe place, however, as it was deeply unwelcoming to outsiders of any sort. Anyone could be under a Grey Gardener's mask, and the town was gripped in fear and suspicion. Today the pall of terror has been lifted from Litrin, but it still has a long way to go before it recovers. The Southern Himbrian Forest Territory. Before the Earthfall Cataclysm, the Southern Himbrian Forest was a part of the Empire of Keonin. After the elves fled Golarion during the Cataclysm, the forest and the surrounding lands, and even central Keonin itself, were taken by the Taldan Empire. When the elves finally returned to Golarion, they retook the woodlands west of the Callous Lake, but were unable to displace human imperial forces east of the lake. Later, during the Taldan Empire's collapse, the elves retook the northern Himbrian forest, forming the elven river kingdoms of Cordillon and Himbria to the north. But the better organized and more united Chelish province of Galt proved too dangerous to invade and lay claim to. However, the elves of Keonin still kind of considered the Himbrian to belong to them, so during the Red Revolution a kind of soft colonization occurred, wherein a number of elven settlements slowly moved into the woodlands. These elves are territorial and dangerous, knowing the risks that come with living in enemy territory. For this reason, though the southern Himbrian has fewer bandits than the Boarwood, it might actually be more dangerous, at least to Galtan nationals. Riverton. Riverton is an interesting and technically independent city-state, although it does lie within the formally recognized Galtan borders. Situated on the shores of Lake Callus, Riverton was founded by an elven swordsman named Neyrel. Like the Himbrian forest, the Wild Wood of Seven Arches was once a part of the Kingdom of Keonin, and Neyrel was planning a secret expedition into the Wildwood to explore some of the elven ruins there. In order to enter Seven Arches in secret, Neyrel engaged the services of a guide who was a worshipper of Hanspur. One night, the guide chose to drown Neyrel as an offering to the water rat, and as the elf flailed and fought for breath and life, he heard a watery voice speak to him, and saw visions of a lakeside community serving Hanspur. Invigorated by this vision, Neyrel surged from the waters of the Selen, and drowned his would-be murderer. Neyrel, the twice-born, as he came to be called after this, began preaching the word of Hanspur, and attracted a group of followers who set up a camp near the floating temple on Callus Lake. This camp would become a refuge for people from the surrounding lands, of which during the Red Revolution there would be many. However, a condition of citizenship was worship of Hanspur, something which has become central to the life here, with newcomers expected to undergo a waterborne rite, a baptism where they are held underwater until they fall unconscious. The river preacher then revives them by making them cough out the water they've inhaled. Daily religious services are held at dusk, and all community members are required to attend. They are held at the shrine of the river god. This modest circular building, constructed from local stone and timber, features a small pier with a carved pole that displays Hanspur's banner in good weather. Inside, the shrine houses a shallow ceremonial pool, a central altar, and living quarters for the river preacher and his attendants. The head attendant is Neyrel's eldest daughter, Mayella, who has been a dedicated follower of Hanspur since childhood. During special services, Neyrel leads worshippers into the lake's waters, where he sometimes experiences visions, thrashing in the shallows and crying out what he sees. These visions have been both protective and condemning, providing insights or dooming intruders and unbelievers. Riverton's economy relies on fishing, and funds brought by pilgrims seeking the river preacher's advice. The community's faithful are also renowned for their expertise as guides and pilots through the perilous waters of the river kingdoms in the north. Visitors can hire rafts or boats for travel upriver or across the lake, with discretion guaranteed for the right price. Riverton can be quite hospitable to travelers willing to listen to Hanspur's teachings or pay for navigation services. Otherwise, strangers are subtly encouraged not to overstay their welcome. The small independent theocracy of Riverton does not pay taxes to Galt or owe Galt any fealty. Although various Galtish councils over the years, even the Grey Gardeners, have attempted to conquer Riverton and bring it more formally into the nation, they've had no success. The Waterborn are all blessed by Hanspur, and the population features a very high number of divine spellcasters, including clerics, inquisitors, and even war priests, which means as a community they are quite resilient against foes that would wish them harm. The city has fortified wooden palisades, and they are fed by the river. Their devotion to Hanspur also gives them a high tolerance for going without adequate food provisions, so it's almost impossible to discourage them through siege as well. Riverton does, however, send a representative each year to the Outlaw Council in Daggermark, and does consider itself a member community of the Federation of River Kingdoms. Neyrel and the city of Riverton are also featured in Part 3 of the first edition Adventure Path Strange Eons. Dabril. Dabril is also featured in the Strange Eons Adventure Path as part of the hero's journey along the Selen. It is a sleepy village with fewer than 1,000 residents, known for its vast fields of roses and its production of exotic perfumes. Though it sits on the river, those who would call it home generally work as gardeners or perfumers rather than anglers or river traders. Like Rosehaven and Azurestone, Dabril is fairly removed from the heartland of Galt, and often over the last 100 years the politics of the Revolutionary Council have seemed very far away from them. Yet even in Dabril, the oppressive nature of the Grey Gardeners would be felt. Whenever suspected dissidents were said to have moved to Dabril, the Gardeners would dispatch specialized inquisitors to apprehend them. A noteworthy such figure was the dogged fugitive tracker called Glower. She had a thick build, a short neck, and a piercing gaze, evident even through the eye-holes of her mask. She gained a particularly grim reputation for always being able to track her quarry. What has happened to Glower since the fall of the Grey Gardeners is unknown. The Horan Plain Territory. The Horan Plain runs from the Selin River to the Stormflood. It is the central growing region of Galt, located in the west of the nation between the Fog Peaks and the southern Himbrian. Before the Red Revolution, farmers here sent their grain to be milled in the city of Litrin, but much of this commerce, like everything else, has been disrupted by Galt's ongoing troubles. Woodsedge. With 15,000 people living here, Woodsedge is one of the larger Galtan cities, and the heart of the Horan Plain territory. The home of the so-called father of the revolution, Darl Yamanik, Woodsedge has always served as the traditional home for dissident thought and radical philosophies. Even with the country in its current state, nothing has changed. No matter who is currently in power, one can almost guarantee that the opposition to them will begin in Woodsedge, and any visitor is almost certain to find some sort of dissident movement afoot. Woodsedge has a very mixed population, serving as a destination for disgraced senators, ousted nobles, and simple outlaws that would not be tolerated in other Galtan cities. As described in my Pathfinder Society faction guide, Woodsedge's other major claim to fame is that it is the host city to the Pathfinder Society's famous Woodsedge Lodge. Though it sustained significant damage during the Red Revolution, it has since been quite well repaired, and it has become an important point of interest in the town in general. The Woodsedge Lodge is a two-story manor with a meeting room, great hall, kitchen, training facility, armory, libraries, master bedroom, and walled-in garden, as well as bedrooms for guests visiting dignitaries and servants on the second floor. The Grand Hall contains the stuffed body of Beaky III, the pet owlbear of former Grand Prince Stavian I of Taldor. The Woodsedge Lodge used to be run by Pathfinder venture captain Eliza Petulengro, a significant figure and a member of the Society's ruling Decemvirate. Since she unmasked herself in 4719, the details of which are discussed in more detail in my Pathfinder Society faction guide, the role of venture captain of the Woodsedge Lodge has passed to her chosen successor, Armeline Giernot, a skilled alchemist and investigator. The Woodsedge Lodge is famous for another reason as well. The lodge features a famous hedge maze, known as the Maze of the Open Road, which was enchanted by the druid Narvan Feathereyes, discussed in more detail in my Andoran deep dive video, to contain a number of magical teleportation circles. Through these circles, the Woodsedge Lodge is connected directly to the Grand Lodge in Absalom, and also to the Open Road Lodge near the White City of Nagisa in the Mwangi Expanse. As the nation of Keonin and the Alajay Elves of Nagisa are entering into a deeper alliance, including a likely marriage between respective leaders, this secret path is being used by the elves now to simplify travel between the two kingdoms, and the Pathfinder Society are being paid for access to this magical gateway. The details of the Alajay and Keonin Elven Alliance is described in my Central Mwangi Expanse deep dive video. Tregan. Tregan is a relatively small town located just on the border of the Taldan prefecture of northern Tandak. With the Fog Peaks in the north and the dense Verduran forest in the south, Tregan sits on the only stretch of open border between Taldor and Galt, outside of the Dragon Pass in Avon Prefecture. During the Red Revolution, Galtan refugees flooded Taldor's northern border. Eventually, the Falspar family began to construct walls along the northern border to control the influx of refugees. The largest gap in that wall is located at the town of Tregan, which has essentially become a refugee town, as Galtans seeking an escape to Taldor get processed and recognized as asylum seekers. It's a miserable place, characterized by the constant press of bodies and endemic malnourishment. Tregan is an important location in the Pathfinder Tales novel The Plague of Shadows by Howard Andrew Jones. The Fog Peaks. The Fog Peaks are a wild, untamed region with large and impressive rocks flying over the northern half near the Borewood. Frost giants are prevalent, and the largest clan, the Fog Stompers, claims a vast area north of the Verduran Fork River's headwaters. Among the Frost giants, Bjarlsfarn the Bloody is particularly notorious, and he is said to wield a magical weapon crafted from the remains of one of the final blades. Other dangerous creatures inhabit the peaks, including winter wolves, ettins, frostworms, thunderbirds, remorazes, and white dragons. Two particularly aggressive white dragons, Icemorn and Mirrorwing, are known to pose a threat to travelers between Wispill and Woodsedge, and are rumored to be the descendants of the ancient and legendary white dragon Kelyanir. Deep beneath the Fog Peaks in eastern Galt, the ancient Cyclops necromancer Terakar is said to reside. Small Taldan settlements on the northern border frequently suffer from giant attacks, especially in the winter. The Ulfin Guard, renowned for their survival and giant hunting skills, occasionally take leave to hunt frost giants and other threats in the Fog Peaks. The Cult of Lies. The period of Thrun rule in Galt was a major boon for diabolical cults in the region. Unfortunately for the devil worshippers, Galt was also a center for the arts and philosophy, and its wellspring of unconventional ideas clashed sharply with the harsh order and cruel justice of Thrune rule. As the Chelish government lost political control of Galt, to survive, Diabolists here had to conceal their allegiances and act with subtlety. The mere accusation of harboring Chelish sympathies could be a death sentence. Some of these individuals perished to final blades, and many others fled the country, but a few believed it was their sacred duty to impose infernal order in place of the chaos engulfing Galt. A powerful young priestess of Asmodeus named Zudra ordered her subordinates to build a temple of Asmodeus deep in the western reaches of the mist-shrouded fog peaks. There, far from the cities and the government's notice, she could gather followers and bring forth devils to enact her god's dark will in Galt. Zudra has performed a variety of tasks in service to Asmodeus and Galt since the days of the First Revolution. Her most recent goal is her most ambitious. It requires the stealing of one of the final blades, and performing a ritual fueled by the souls within. She has been gradually calling devils to the material plane to assist in the task. Every successful infernal ceremony empowers the cult with more infernal knowledge, devil servitors, and planar influence. As the cult grows more powerful, it also becomes more conspicuous, but so far its activities seem to have gone unchecked. Thrillheim. Thrillheim is the ruined city of the Frost Giant nation that once controlled much of the Fog Peaks. The Frost Giants existed in a society where strength dictated leadership, with their kingdom being a loose confederation of tribes. The strongest and most politically astute giant was given the title of Kernig, or Jarl of Jarls. The Kernig ruled from Thrillheim, a massive city of stone and ice inhabited by thousands of giants and their elemental slaves. Monstrous gargoyles guarded the city. The frost giants of the Fog Peaks followed Rovagug, and to a lesser extent Gorum, while also respecting the spirits of the mountains, including the Nordine Glacier and a vast tunneling worm that was said to live beneath them. They also revered Kelyanir, an elder white dragon, from a respectful distance. The last Kernig, Virtosk, proved his bravery as a youth, by stealing the magical sword Eldavar from Kelyanir's treasure hoard. As he matured, he became adept in battle and subterfuge, eventually becoming Kernig. Despite rarely leaving her lair, the dragon Kelyanir eventually learned of Virtosk's theft and ascension to Kernig, and she demanded the return of Eldavar, restitution, and Virtosk's execution. Virtosk naturally refused and called for her death. This defiance created a schism among the giants. Most sided with Virtosk, but a sizable minority, including many shamans and opportunists, joined the dragon Kelyanir and her loose coalition of disciples. After years of conflict, Kelyanir gambled her forces on a siege of Thrillheim itself. The dragon found Kernig Virtosk entrenched near a waterfall, and their epic battle ended with Virtosk stabbing Kelyanir in the heart. Both plummeted to their deaths. This event marked the end of the frost giant kingdom of Thrillheim. The surviving giants of today have become restless nomads, the itinerant remnants of a once powerful nation. The Minaret. There are peaks in Golarion so tall that they scrape against the veil that separates the plains. Both Mar Massif in Varissia and Menu Su in the Wall of Heaven mountains of Tianxia are such peaks, containing small breaches to the nightmare realm of Leng. The fog peaks may have such a breach as well. Near the central fog peaks, on those rare occasions when the clouds open up to reveal the upper reaches, scholars in Litrin once examined the ancient stonework upon them with large spyglasses. The sketches they produced of the structures there have dubbed one particular site the Minaret, although none can say who built it or why. Based on the design of the structure, it may be of alien or extraplanar origin, but the peaks are so high and treacherous here that it has never been properly explored. Mount Cania and Cania's Drop. Long before the fall of the giant kingdom of Thrillheim and the arrival of the Taldans, dragons were the unquestioned rulers of the Fog Peaks. These ancient dragons had mortal disciples, Kelid mystics, who worshipped them as gods. Although these ancient pre-Taldan histories have largely been lost to time, one figure endures, Amau the Frost Blossom, who embarked on a spirit journey high up into Mount Cania to find a sacred flower, which granted him 4 eternal truths. Amau lived in the icy heights for over a century before dying. His bones were buried in a cairn near his cave, overlooking the surrounding peaks. Thanks to this enduring myth, there has always been an interest in Mount Cania, and so various way stations have been constructed in the foothills of the mountains. Cania's Drop is one of the several dozen way stations erected in the Fog Peaks. Situated to provide aid to travelers and keep watch over the surrounding lands, these stations are manned by outcasts, exiles, former criminals, and others who simply seek isolation or penance. Mount Cania and Cania's Drop are featured in the first edition Pathfinder Society adventure To Scale the Dragon. The Dragon Pass. Also featured in To Scale the Dragon is the Dragon Pass. The pass serves as a treacherous but passable gap in the Fog Peaks that permits travel between Taldor and Galt, though only skilled mountaineers should attempt it. At a portion of the pass known as the Talons, the pass splits into two routes, one of which continues to the bordering nation, and the other which tracks the path all the way up to Cania's Drop and Mount Cania. The Nordine Glacier. The Nordine Glacier is the location where the Red Raven took the Vernal Key to liberate his paramour Jeppa of Casimir. The glacier was the domain of a Jathum air genie that called itself the Jarl of the North Wind. Ruling over a small private kingdom of ice mephits, frost giants, and yetis, the Jarl of the North Wind ruled his domain like a mad emperor, demanding his every whim be satisfied. Based on how later adventures have played out, it seems likely the heroes of the Flight of the Red Raven AP eventually allied with the Red Raven, liberated Jeppa and his other companion, the elven sorcerer Kale, and made off with the Jarl's treasure hoard. It is also likely that the Jarl himself was slain in the course of these events. The Dread Dungeons. A final location in the Fog Peaks of the Dread Dungeons, constructed by the Primarch Bremavir, who led one of Galt's many interim governments since the Red Revolution. The entrance to the Dread Dungeons is actually located quite high in the Fog Peaks, though Bremavir's complex occupies no more than the first few levels of the massive system of tunnels and chambers that he discovered there. Below those are the Darrow Tunnels. To this day, the aged Bremavir sits atop his ill-gotten treasures, surrounded by loyal Galtan guards and Darrow allies, while below the labyrinthine dungeons extends on downwards towards Narvoth. Many political prisoners and innocent hostages alike still languish in deep cells. Even though some prisoners have long since served out their sentences, Bremavir dares not let the prisoners escape, fearing discovery at the hands of Camelia Dranik and the new government.